It was a Saturday morning, one of those gray mornings when the sun hides behind the clouds and the air feels heavier than it should. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee, trying to calm the pounding in my chest before heading to the hospital. My name is Evelyn, and the story I am about to tell you is not one I ever imagined I would have to share with the world. But sometimes silence becomes unbearable, and the only way to reclaim your dignity is to put the truth into words. That morning, I was scheduled for surgery, a procedure that had been looming over me for weeks. I had prepared every detail in advance: who would drive me, how long I would stay, even which pajamas I would wear in recovery. The only thing I could not control was who would care for my 4-year-old twins, Mia and Noah, while I was under anesthesia. And that responsibility, I thought, would naturally fall to the people who once promised me unconditional love, my parents. I remember the way my phone buzzed on the table. A message flashed across the screen from my mother. I can still see her words burned into my mind. "We can't watch the kids. You'll have to figure something else out. You've become such a burden." My stomach dropped. I read the words again, thinking maybe fatigue was playing tricks on me, but no, they were there, cruel and sharp. A burden. That was what she called me, while I was hours away from being cut open in a sterile operating room. Before I could even respond, another message arrived, this one almost casual. "We're heading out later. Got tickets to a concert tonight. We need this." They had chosen music, laughter, and neon lights over the lives of their grandchildren and the well-being of their own daughter. For a moment, the room around me dissolved. The ticking clock on the wall was louder than usual. The refrigerator hummed like a warning siren. I felt heat rise up my neck, my palms sweating against the cool surface of my coffee mug. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled down the street, and for a second, I envied the driver. He had somewhere to be, something to deliver, a purpose that did not involve being discarded by his own family. I sat there frozen, staring at the tiny screen, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something softer, something less vicious. But they didn't. They stayed right there, mocking me. I forced myself to breathe. Inhale, exhale. My hands trembled as I reached for the edge of the table. I wanted to scream, to call them, to demand how they could abandon me like this. Instead, I swallowed the rising tide of panic and whispered to myself, "You're not going to break today." That sentence became my anchor. I straightened my back and grabbed my phone, scrolling through contacts until I landed on Claire, a neighbor who had become my unexpected friend over the years. She was not related to me by blood, but she had shown me more kindness than my parents had in years. My voice cracked when I asked if she could help. Without hesitation, she said yes. Relief mixed with humiliation. Relief that someone cared. Humiliation that it wasn't the people who should have been there. As I sat back, I thought about the word my mother had used. Burden. It echoed in my ears like a verdict. It was not the first time they had let me down, but somehow this cut deeper than all the others. Maybe it was the timing, maybe it was the sheer cruelty of prioritizing a night out over my surgery, or maybe it was the final proof that I was never going to be enough for them. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rhythm of betrayal I could not ignore. I could feel my throat tighten, tears burning at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not then. Not yet. I wish I could tell you that this moment shocked me, because it was out of character, but that would be a lie. Looking back, I see the trail of smaller betrayals that led here. Birthdays skipped, emergencies brushed aside, subtle digs about me being too serious or too demanding. They had always found ways to remind me that I was an inconvenience. This time, though, they didn't just remind me, they spelled it out, letter by letter, on my phone screen. And in that instant, I realized something that would change everything. If I didn't take control of my life, if I didn't draw a line right here, then I would always be that burden they spoke of. The minutes before leaving for the hospital stretched on like hours. My twins padded into the kitchen in their pajamas, their little feet tapping against the tile floor. Mia carried her stuffed rabbit, and Noah was still rubbing sleep from his eyes. They looked at me with the kind of trust only children can give, pure and unshakable. My chest ached at the thought of what my parents had chosen to walk away from. I knelt down and hugged them both, inhaling the scent of syrup from last night's pancakes lingering in their hair. I whispered promises I intended to keep, that they would never feel unwanted the way I had, that they would always know they were my world. I didn't tell them that their grandparents had abandoned us. I didn't want to stain their innocence with the truth just yet. Instead, I smiled through the pain and told them Claire would be with them while I was gone. They nodded, unbothered, as children often are, but my heart twisted at the thought of the years to come. How many more times would my parents choose themselves over us? How many more wounds would I let them inflict before I finally severed the tie? Those questions lingered as I gathered my things and prepared to leave. When Claire arrived, she wrapped me in a hug that felt steadier than anything I had received from my parents in years. "Don't worry," she said softly. "I've got them. Focus on healing." It was simple, but it was everything. I looked back at Mia and Noah, standing side by side, and I felt the weight of generations crashing down. I walked out of that house knowing something I hadn't dared admit before. My parents' choice had freed me. Their cruelty had forced me to see the truth. And though it hurt, it was also the beginning of something new. I didn't know it then, but their betrayal would become the moment I stopped waiting for their approval and started writing my own story. The hospital smell was sharp in my nose, antiseptic and cold, the kind of smell that clings to you even after you leave. As I lay in the pre-op room with a thin blanket pulled up to my chin, I kept replaying the morning over and over in my head. The betrayal still pulsed in my veins like a second heartbeat. My parents were probably getting ready for their concert, choosing outfits, making plans for dinner before the show, while I was staring at the ceiling tiles, trying to calm my nerves before anesthesia took me under. The contrast was so brutal it almost felt like a cruel joke. I kept thinking, how did it come to this? When did my own family decide I wasn't worth the inconvenience? To answer that question, you have to understand the history that led me here. Growing up, I was the responsible one. I was the child who cleaned up after dinner without being asked, who got good grades, who learned to soothe herself when comfort was withheld. My younger brother, Daniel, was the opposite. He was the golden child, the one they indulged and protected, the one who could do no wrong. I cannot count the times I was told, "Be understanding, Evelyn. Your brother has more needs." That line became a refrain in my life, a justification for every slight, every forgotten birthday, every moment when I needed them and they looked away. One memory stands out like a bruise that never fades. I was 17 when I fainted in the kitchen after a week of pushing myself too hard with exams, shifts at the diner, and looking after Daniel when he didn't feel like going to practice. When I came to, lying on the linoleum floor, I heard my mother's voice. Not panicked, but annoyed. "Evelyn, you can't keep doing this. You're scaring your brother." That was her first reaction. Not bull. "Are you okay?" Not, "Let's get you help." Just frustration that my collapse had inconvenienced him. My father carried me to the couch, muttering something about how I needed to build resilience, and that was the end of it. I was never taken to a doctor. They pretended it never happened. I learned to pretend too. Another time, when I was in college, I got pneumonia after working 2 jobs through a brutal winter. I called my mom, voice hoarse, asking if she could bring me soup or just come sit with me for a little while. She sighed and said, "I promised Daniel I'd help him set up his new apartment. You understand, right?" Of course I said yes. I always said yes. That was my role in the family, to understand, to absorb the blows, to keep standing even when no one stood for me. But a person can only bend so far before they break. That pattern continued into adulthood. When I had my twins, I thought maybe things would change. I thought becoming grandparents would awaken some dormant instinct in them, something that would finally make me matter. At first, they played the part, cooing at the babies, taking photos, posting them online as if to prove to the world they were doting. But the cracks showed quickly. They babysat only when it suited their schedule. They made comments about how exhausting the kids were, how much energy I demanded from them. My father once joked at Thanksgiving that I'd turned into a baby factory, and everyone laughed while I sat there silently, my face burning. The truth is, the signs were always there. Every skipped responsibility, every sarcastic comment, Every time they chose leisure over loyalty was a breadcrumb leading to the moment they refused to care for Mia and Noah before my surgery. Still, I had clung to hope. I told myself that maybe this time they would show up. Maybe this time they would see me not as a nuisance, but as their daughter in need. Hope is stubborn that way. It hangs on even when reason tells you to let go. That morning, when the text came through, hope finally shattered. As I waited for the nurse to wheel me into surgery, I thought about the little signs I had ignored in the weeks leading up to this. My mother had been vague whenever I mentioned the operation. She'd say things like, "We'll see how we feel," or "Let's talk about it later." My father barely acknowledged it at all, changing the subject whenever I brought it up. I chalked it up to their discomfort with hospitals, but now I realized it was avoidance. They had no intention of being there. Their silence wasn't uncertainty, it was a decision they'd already made. The nurse came in, her voice calm and kind, asking if I was ready. I nodded, though my chest was tight with more than just fear of the procedure. As they rolled me down the hall, the fluorescent lights passing overhead like a conveyor belt, I closed my eyes and tried to picture Mia and Noah at home with Claire. That image steadied me. Their little faces, their small hands reaching for mine, their laughter echoing in the rooms of a house that had too often felt heavy with disappointment. They were my reason for enduring, my proof that love could be real even if it didn't come from the people who raised me. But beneath that love was another feeling, one I had been too afraid to admit until now: anger. Not the fleeting kind that comes and goes like a storm, but the deep, simmering anger that builds over years of neglect. Anger at being sidelined, at being called names, at being made to feel like a mistake. It grew louder in my chest with every step toward the operating room. For once, I did not push it down. I let it rise, let it fuel me, because I knew I would need it. I would need that fire for what came after, when I finally decided to stop begging for scraps of love from people who had already chosen to leave me hungry. When I woke up after surgery, the first thing I noticed was the heaviness in my chest and the faint beeping of machines around me. The second thing I noticed was the silence. No one was sitting in the chair beside my bed, no familiar faces waiting with flowers or nervous smiles. It was just me, the sterile walls, and the dull ache of being forgotten. The nurse told me I had done well and that my recovery would take a few days, but her kindness only sharpened the ache. I thought of Claire, probably at my house making sure Mia and Noah had their dinner, while my parents were likely at the concert venue, clapping along to songs without a single thought for the daughter they had left behind. That image sank into me like a stone, and for the first time I realized this was not a single moment of abandonment. It was the climax of a story they had been writing for years. This was not the first time they had left me standing alone. When I was a teenager, I learned quickly that asking for help was dangerous because help was always conditional. If Daniel needed something, they moved mountains. If I needed something, I was told to toughen up. I remember my junior year of high school when I had been accepted into a state-level writing competition. I begged them to come with me to the award ceremony 2 hours away. My father told me gas was too expensive, and my mother said she had promised Daniel she would watch his basketball practice. I went alone, sitting on the bus with my speech trembling in my hands. When I won second place, I looked out at the cheering crowd, searching for a familiar face. There was none. I clapped for myself quietly and carried the certificate home in a plastic folder. When I showed them, my mother glanced at it and said, "That's nice, but don't get too full of yourself. Daniel has a big game tomorrow." That was the rhythm of my youth. Small triumphs buried beneath someone else's spotlight. In college, the cycle deepened. I worked 2 jobs to pay tuition while Daniel burned through his allowance on trips and parties. My father would shake his head and tell me, "Your brother just needs to find himself. You'll be fine. You've always been the strong one." What he really meant was that I could be neglected because I would survive it. I remember one night when my car broke down on the side of a dark road in the middle of winter. I called my parents, freezing, hoping they could send someone. My father answered and said, "We're tired, Evelyn. Call a tow truck." When I reminded him I couldn't afford one, he sighed and said, then maybe you shouldn't be driving such an old car. I ended up walking half a mile to a gas station, shivering until a stranger gave me a ride home. The next morning, Daniel called me asking for money to cover his overdue phone bill. My parents urged me to help him out, insisting it was just what family does. Family for them had always been a one-way street. Even after I became a mother, their priorities never shifted. When Mia and Noah were newborns, I was drowning in exhaustion. One afternoon, I called my mom, whispering through tears that I hadn't slept in 2 days. She told me she couldn't come because she and my dad had theater tickets they had been looking forward to. "You'll figure it out," she said lightly, and then she hung up. I sat on the floor of my living room with 2 crying infants and realized I was still the same girl I had always been, waiting for care that would never come. And yet, despite all of this, I kept giving them the benefit of the doubt, kept hoping they would change. The hardest part was the gaslighting, the way they managed to make me question my own worth. They had phrases they repeated like scripts. "Don't be dramatic. You're too sensitive. We raised you to be independent." Those words dug into my skin until I began to believe them. Whenever I felt hurt, I reminded myself not to overreact. Whenever I felt invisible, I told myself that independence was a gift. But the truth was simpler and much harsher. They just did not want to make space for me. Lying in that hospital bed, I thought about all the times I had tried to excuse their behavior. Maybe they were stressed. Maybe they were tired. Maybe I was expecting too much. But the concert tickets ended that illusion. Choosing music and bright lights over their own daughter's surgery wasn't stress or tiredness. It was a choice. It was the purest expression of their priorities. And this time, I could not excuse it. This time, I would not excuse it. When the nurse left and I was alone again, I picked up my phone and scrolled through social media, half out of habit, half out of masochism. There it was, a picture my parents had posted. They were standing outside the concert hall, smiling wide, holding programs in their hands. The caption read, "Finally a night for ourselves. We deserve it." My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. My surgery was not mentioned. My children were not mentioned. I did not exist in their world except as an afterthought, a burden to be brushed away so they could celebrate themselves. It was not the photo that broke me. It was the comments beneath it. Friends of theirs congratulating them, saying things like, "You two are the best parents." I wanted to scream at those strangers to tell them the truth, but instead, I turned off my phone and lay there in the dim light, feeling the final thread of my loyalty snap. That night, as the painkillers dulled the ache in my body, I thought about what would happen when I went home. I knew there would be messages from them, excuses about how they couldn't cancel the tickets, maybe even jokes about how I would understand once I was rested. But I also knew something had changed in me. This was not just another slight to be absorbed. This was the proof I had needed all along, that I had spent my life begging for crumbs of affection from people who had no intention of feeding me. For years, I had been waiting for them to love me the way I loved them. Now, staring at the blank ceiling, I understood. That wait was over. When I was finally discharged from the hospital, the sky was dark and heavy with rain clouds, the kind of sky that makes you feel smaller than you already are. Claire drove me home, and as she pulled into the driveway, I could see the warm glow of lights through the curtains. Mia and Noah ran to the door the second we stepped inside, their little arms wrapping around me with such force it made my stitches sting. For the first time in days, I felt alive again. But as I tucked them into bed later that night, my phone lit up with messages from my parents. At first, I ignored them. I thought I could stay in the quiet bubble of recovery and love, but the buzzing wouldn't stop. So I opened the messages, and what I read left me breathless. "Hope the surgery went well," my mom wrote. "Sorry we couldn't help this time. You know we needed a break." My father followed with, "You should be more grateful for what we've done for you in the past. Don't make us the villains." I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening, my body trembling with something that was no longer just sadness. It was fury. They weren't apologizing. They weren't acknowledging the gravity of what they had done. They were reframing it, turning themselves into martyrs who had sacrificed so much that one night at a concert was somehow deserved. And then, as if to twist the knife deeper, my mother added, Claire should not be raising your children. That is not her responsibility. Family should handle family. I nearly dropped the phone. The hypocrisy was so sharp it was almost laughable. They had abandoned me, yet they wanted to scold me for leaning on someone else. The next day, they showed up at my house unannounced. I was sitting on the couch with a blanket over my legs when the doorbell rang, followed by the sound of the door opening before I could even get up. They still had a spare key. My father walked in first, holding a paper bag with takeout, as if food could erase the gaping wound between us. My mother trailed behind him, her face composed, almost smug. "We thought you might need dinner," she said, setting the bag on the counter. My heart raced, my throat dry, but I forced myself to stand. "We need to talk," I said firmly. They both looked at me with expressions that suggested I was being overly dramatic. My father sat at the table, unwrapping the food, while my mother crossed her arms. I told them everything I had been holding in: the texts, the silence, the years of neglect. My voice shook at first, but then it grew stronger. "You left me alone before major surgery. You called me a burden, and then you chose a concert over your grandchildren. Do you understand what that means?" My father leaned back in his chair, sighing as if I had inconvenienced him with my emotions. "You're exaggerating. We didn't call you a burden. We just said you can be too much sometimes, and we couldn't waste the tickets." The calmness of his tone enraged me. He didn't see it as betrayal, only as a minor scheduling conflict. My mother chimed in, "You've always been too sensitive. We've done more for you than you realize. You should thank us for raising you the way we did." Something inside me snapped. I had heard those phrases before, countless times, and every time I swallowed them. Not this time. My voice cut through the room like glass. "No, what you did was not parenting. What you did was neglect, and I am done pretending otherwise." My mother's lips tightened, but she didn't respond. My father stood towering over me, his eyes narrowing. "Be careful, Evelyn. Don't burn bridges you'll regret later." I laughed bitterly, a sound I barely recognized as my own. "The bridge has already burned. You lit the match." The tension in the room thickened until even Mia and Noah peeked out from their bedroom, sensing the storm. I scooped them up, carrying them back inside, whispering that everything was okay, even though it wasn't. When I returned, my parents were gathering their things, muttering about how ungrateful I was, how I had been poisoned by outsiders like Claire. My mother paused at the door and said, "One day you'll realize we were right. You'll come back." I looked at her with a calmness I didn't feel and answered, "No. One day you'll realize what you lost." They left, slamming the door behind them, the echo ringing through the house like an aftershock. I stood there in the quiet, my chest rising and falling, my heart pounding, but for the first time I felt something new: clarity. I knew that confrontation was not the end, but the beginning. Their words had not broken me this time. They had set me free. The loyalty I had clung to my entire life had dissolved, leaving me with something stronger than hope: resolve. I was no longer waiting for them to change. I was changing the story myself. The days following that confrontation were heavy but strangely liberating. My parents did not call for 3 days, and the silence was almost a gift. I thought maybe they had finally realized how deeply they had hurt me, but by the 4th day the phone started ringing again. At first, I let it go to voicemail. When I finally listened, my father's voice filled the room. "Evelyn, you're overreacting. You can't just cut us off like this. Family sticks together." His tone was more commanding than apologetic, as if he believed he still held authority over me. Then my mother's softer voice came through. "We didn't mean to upset you. You have to understand, we've been tired. Raising you and Daniel wasn't easy, and now with your kids, it just feels like too much sometimes." The way she said "your kids" made it sound as though Mia and Noah were strangers, not her grandchildren. That night, I sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone, my hands shaking. For years, I had swallowed their excuses, but this time, I decided to take action. I drafted a message in the family group chat, not just to them, but to my aunts, uncles, and cousins. I explained what had happened: how my parents refused to help when I was facing surgery, how they called me a burden, and how they chose a concert over their own grandchildren. I attached screenshots of the text messages, proof that could not be twisted into something else. My finger hovered over the send button for a long time before I finally pressed it. Within minutes, the silence broke. My cousin Anna replied first, her words sharp. "I can't believe they did this to you, Evelyn. This is disgusting." Then another cousin chimed in. "We always wondered why you seemed left out at gatherings. Now it makes sense." One by one, the messages poured in. Some were supportive, some were shocked, and a few were hesitant, clearly unsure how to handle the reality I had laid bare. But the most telling response came from my parents. My father exploded in the chat. "How dare you drag family matters into public like this? You're trying to make us look like monsters." My mother followed with, "This is unfair. You've twisted the story to make yourself the victim. We did our best." Their words were furious, but beneath the fury I sensed fear. The fear of their carefully crafted image shattering. The next morning, my phone buzzed nonstop. My aunt called to say she had confronted my parents directly. According to her, my father had stormed out of the room, and my mother had cried, saying she felt betrayed. I almost laughed at the irony. Betrayed. That was their word, as if my truth-telling was the crime, not their abandonment. But instead of laughing, I felt a strange calm wash over me. For once, I wasn't the one hiding or covering for them. For once, the truth was in the open. That weekend, my parents came to my house again, this time banging on the door until Claire, who was visiting, told them firmly to leave. When they refused, I stepped outside, shutting the door behind me so Mia and Noah wouldn't hear. My father's face was red with anger. "You've humiliated us? Do you understand what you've done?" I looked at him steadily and replied, "I've told the truth. If the truth humiliates you, that's not my fault." My mother's eyes brimmed with tears, but they were not the tears of remorse. They were tears of someone upset about losing control. "Evelyn, you're tearing this family apart," she whispered. I shook my head. "No, you did that when you walked away from me and your grandchildren. I'm just refusing to cover for you anymore." The standoff ended with them leaving again, muttering threats about cutting me out of wills and family events, as if those were weapons I could not live without. What they didn't understand was that they had already cut me out years ago. They just hadn't admitted it. That night, I sat with Claire after putting the kids to bed. She poured me a glass of water and said quietly, "You know they'll never see it the way you do." I nodded. I know, but I needed to stop pretending. In the weeks that followed, the fallout spread. Some relatives sided with my parents, saying I should have kept things private. Others reached out quietly to tell me they admired my courage. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, not by my parents, but by people who had witnessed the truth and chosen to acknowledge it. My parents, meanwhile, doubled down on their narrative. They told anyone who would listen that I was ungrateful, that I had always been dramatic, that Claire had poisoned me against them. The difference now was that fewer people believed them. One night, as I tucked Mia and Noah into bed, Noah asked Mom, "Why don't Grandma and Grandpa come around anymore?" The question pierced me, but I answered honestly without cruelty. Because sometimes people make choices that hurt others. And when they do, we have to protect ourselves. But you have me, and you always will. He nodded sleepily, satisfied with the answer. In that moment, I realized something important. Breaking away from my parents wasn't just about me. It was about teaching my children that they never had to accept being treated as less than they deserved. My parents wanted me to believe that exposing their betrayal was the ultimate act of disloyalty. But in truth, my silence all those years had been disloyalty to myself. Speaking up, setting boundaries, cutting off the cycle, that was loyalty, not just to me, but to Mia and Noah. I had finally chosen us over them. And though it hurt, it also healed. In the weeks that followed, the storm settled. But the silence it left behind was unlike any I had known before. For the first time in my life, my parents were no longer part of my daily orbit. There were no calls, no messages, except the occasional angry voicemail that I refused to answer. The house felt lighter without their presence looming over me. And yet there were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how different my life could have been if they had chosen love instead of neglect. But every time I looked at Mia and Noah, I knew I had made the right decision. Their laughter filled the spaces that once held my doubt. their small hands in mine reminding me that family is not defined by obligation, but by presence. One Saturday morning, I took them to the park. The sun was warm, the grass freshly cut, and I watched them chase each other across the field, their giggles ringing in the air. As I sat on the bench, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. Not the fragile peace that cracks under the weight of disappointment, but a real, grounded peace that comes from knowing I had broken a toxic cycle. I thought back to all the years I spent begging for scraps of affection from people who only ever saw me as a burden. Letting go was painful, but watching my children thrive in the love I could give them made every moment worth it. It wasn't just about cutting ties, it was about rewriting the story. I no longer saw myself as the abandoned daughter, the forgotten sibling, the invisible woman trying to earn a place in her own family. I was Evelyn, a mother who chose to protect her children, a woman who finally chose herself. And in that choice, I found freedom. I realized that blood may connect us, but it does not bind us to mistreatment. True family is built in the moments of showing up, in the everyday acts of care, in the people who prove by their actions that you matter. The hardest lesson I learned through this was that sometimes the people who are supposed to love us unconditionally are the ones who hurt us the most. But that pain does not have to define us. We have the power to set boundaries, to demand respect, to create a life where love is not conditional. For years, I thought forgiving meant forgetting. But now I understand that true forgiveness is setting yourself free, even if it means walking away. There will always be people who tell me I went too far, that I should have stayed quiet to keep the peace. But peace built on silence is not peace at all. It is captivity. What I did was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of survival, of choosing to break a chain that had bound me for too long. My children will grow up knowing their worth, never questioning if they are too much or not enough. They will know that love is steady, not selective. If you are listening to my story and you see pieces of yourself in it, know this: you are not alone. You do not have to keep setting yourself on fire to keep others warm. Your worth is not measured by how much you can endure, but by the love you give and the love you allow yourself to receive. Choosing to walk away from toxic family is not betrayal. Sometimes it is the bravest form of self-respect. As I watch Mia and Noah grow, I no longer feel the sting of being unwanted. I feel the strength of creating a home where laughter is louder than criticism, where hugs replace cold silences, where love is abundant and freely given. That is the legacy I choose to leave behind. Not bitterness, not resentment, but resilience and truth. And so, my story ends not with despair, but with hope. Hope that others who have carried similar burdens will realize they are allowed to put them down. Hope that by sharing this, I can remind someone else that they deserve better too. Because in the end, life is too short to wait for people to love you the way they should. Sometimes the only way forward is to love yourself enough to let go. If this story has stayed with you, if it has made you think about your own life, I invite you to stay connected. There are countless stories like mine. Stories of heartbreak, resilience, and transformation. By subscribing, you won't just be hearing my voice. You'll be part of a community where truth matters and healing is possible. Because sometimes the first step to freedom is simply knowing you are not walking it alone.